Chapter 2: Understanding Archetypes. As discussed earlier, each archetype is its own system of processing reality through the use of cognitive functions. They are not a list of binary results, such as whether an individual is a thinker or a feeler. Humanity can't be simplified to such a minimalistic degree. Everything is much more complex than how someone fits in a binary. So instead of reading the types as their relationship to the binary, read them for what functions they use. Every ENXP type will have extroverted intuition as a primary function and an introverted rational auxiliary function. Every XNXP will have extroverted intuition and an introverted rationalist function as their primary and auxiliary pair. Although the order will be different, as according to the first variable in the archetype, extroversion and introversion. This is because the first variable determines whether the archetype's primary function is introverted or extroverted. The last variable determines whether or not the extroverted function will be rational or an irrational function. The rationalist functions, as discussed, are thinking and feeling. The irrational functions are intuition and sensation. While considering this, it is important to note that irrational does not mean wrong or immature. Much, if not most, of life is irrational. Our sensation and our inclinations point to something much larger than our understanding. We cannot write down why sex is so satisfying, nor can we explain how we know where danger is in the city that we live in. These are parts of the human experience that aren't meant to be explained, but that are perfectly valid. They are called irrational functions because they function beyond our understanding, not because they don't function correctly. For extroverts, all judging archetypes have an extroverted rationalist function as their primary function, either extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling. These types include the ENTJ, the ESTJ, the ENFJ, and the ESFJ. The perceiving extroverts all have an extroverted irrational function as their primary function, either extroverted sensing or extroverted intuition. These types are the ESFP, the ESTP, the ENFP, and the ENTP. When you're reading the archetypes, start with the last two letters to get a basis of what you're dealing with. If you have an EXXJ, then you know that their primary function is either extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, and that their auxiliary function is either introverted sensation or introverted intuition. For introverts, the opposite is true. This is because the final variable in the archetypes does not address the primary function, but the primary extroverted function. So, the INFP, according to the logic used to decode extroverts, should be an intuitive lead. This is, and it isn't true, because the INFP has extroverted intuition as their auxiliary function, meaning it is how they communicate with the world around them. However, their primary function is introverted feeling, which means that they are rational type. The same is true for the INTJ, who looks like they should have a rational function according to the logic used to decode the extroverts. However, the INTJ has introverted intuition as a primary function and extroverted thinking as an auxiliary function. This means that the INTJ is a perceiving type, even though they communicate through extroverted thinking. This system can be confusing, but it is a way to simplify how to observe the interactions of others. An INTP is not known through their expression of introverted thinking, even though it is their primary function. INTPs often develop it by themselves, for themselves, and keep aloof in life. Instead of focusing on analysis, they'll end up relying on absurd humor and working with people around them. This is because their primary social function is extroverted intuition. So when they communicate, it is easier for them to play off people using their intuition than it is for them to explain their introverted thinking to the point that people can adequately understand. For INTJs, the opposite situation occurs. They are deep, deep people who are not thinking as much as they are channeling some sort of inner wisdom. Introverted intuition is the hardest function to describe. One of the closest parallels that can be drawn is to ancestral wisdom. Within themselves, there is a vision that cannot exactly be explained. Due to this, the INTJ does not try to communicate through introverted intuition, but instead relies on extroverted thinking. As introverted intuition is impossible to follow, extroverted thinking is one of the most literal functions. It is the function that dominates academic science and other such prestigious systems. Due to this, the INTJs come off as hyper-rational type, even though they rely more on their inner irrationality than they do on the rationality they manifest into the world around them. So through understanding this, we can understand why the archetypes are labeled for their primary extroverted function instead of their primary functions. Introverted functions are harder to observe in people, and while socializing, all archetypes are more likely to rely on their extroverted functions than their introverted functions, despite whether or not they are introverted or extroverted. Now we understand how to read the first and last letters of the archetypes. The first letter determines whether the first function is an introverted or extroverted function, and the last letter determines which function is extroverted. This information also fills out the half of the structure of the rest of the archetype. For example, if you have an EXXP, you know that they have an extroverted irrational primary function, an introverted rational auxiliary function, an extroverted rational tertiary function, and an introverted irrational function as their inferior function. For an IXXJ, you know that you have an introverted irrational primary function, an extroverted rational auxiliary function, an introverted rational tertiary function, and an extroverted irrational inferior function. This framework is a great place to start because once you have it mapped out, it's just a matter of applying the middle two variables. If you take your understanding of the IXXJ types and apply to the ISTJ, you can easily decode the functions. You know that the primary function is an introverted irrational function, and you know that the secondary will be an extroverted rational function. This is easy to remember if you know that the last variable determines the primary extroverted function, not necessarily the primary function for all types. With this information, you can see that the ISTJ has thinking for their rational function and sensing for their irrational function. As you remember that they have an introverted irrational function for their primary function, you can decode that their primary function is introverted sensation, seeing that thinking must be one of their first two functions, and with the opposite energy, you can easily see that the ISTJ's auxiliary function is extroverted thinking. Now that you have those two functions, the other two are easy to find, as the tertiary function is the inverse of auxiliary. So for the ISTJ, that means introverted feeling, and the inferior function is the opposite of the primary function, which leaves us seeing that extroverted intuition is the inferior function of the ISTJ. Every archetype should be understood through this and not in any other way. The reason for this is that the archetypes reveal the tools that an individual is working with, not how their future will be. There is no reason for any particular type, nor is there a certain path for any type. There have been brilliant artists from every side of humanity, just as there have been brilliant thinkers from everywhere too. You are not limited by how you were born, but you can always be lifted up by what you were given if you are grateful for what you have. The functions are the foundation for everything in relation to this theory. Without understanding them, this will be an exercise in labeling people, not understanding psychology. Once you start paying attention to the functions, you will realize that the importance isn't in what type someone is, but in how they manifest their functions. This is because people are incredibly complex and you can't predict their actions, but you can perceive it. Instead of focusing on how INTJs act, Focus on the way that they communicate. Gain experience with other types and see what groupings make sense to you. Some people group the types based on their middle letters, meaning that INTJs would be part of the NTs or intuitive thinkers. These types include INTJs, INTPs, ENTJs, and ENTPs. Observe them and see whether you think that they communicate in similar ways because they all share a preference for intuition and thought. Once you have your understanding of those types, now try to organize INTJs and ENTJs with ESFPs and ISFPs. Put the INTPs and the ENTPs with ISFJs and ESFJs. Notice the way that they communicate. The benefit by organizing the archetypes in such a way may seem counterintuitive, but the opposite archetypes actually rely on all of the same functions. This means that the INTJ and the ESFP are using exactly the same functions to communicate, only in different orders than one another. While that might sound like an issue theoretically, most of the time it is radically beneficial. This is because of the inferior function does not work as a weakness, but as a need. The INTJ is not impaired in their extroverted sensation, but not as able to make use of it as they are introverted intuition. Due to this, the INTJ does not reject extroverted sensation, but actually craves it. Most of them try to accommodate this by developing their sense of taste. Often, INTJs will be attracted to sports cars or beautiful outfits because they want to fulfill that inner desire within them that extroverted sensation breeds as an inferior function. The ESFP is dealing with the opposite situation. While they are naturally gifted at sports, design, and physically manipulating the world around them, they often struggle to find purpose or to build a vision. Just as the INTJ is buried by their own intuition, the ESFP can find themselves endlessly swimming through the world around them, trying desperately to find meaning in what they do, but only find more activity. Due to these attitudes in both the INTJ and the ESFP, the relationship between them has great potential for both types. While the ESFP can provide the INTJ with the presentation, experience, and aesthetics that the INTJ craves, the INTJ can provide the direction, practicality, and purpose that the ESFP desires. This means that communication is naturally conducive between the two types, even though they couldn't be further on the binary. This is because the archetypes are not supposed to be solid. Everyone should be striving to achieve balance within their lives. You do not learn your archetype to learn your strengths and weaknesses, but your journey towards harmony. Your inferior function is not one that you should ignore or one that is unfavorable towards you, but one that you must comfort and grow to appreciate. Understanding this, it's easy to see why opposite archetypes are so good for each other. For an INTJ to be happy, their extroverted sensation must be healthy. Just as for ESFP to be happy, their introverted intuition must be healthy. It's difficult for every archetype to address their inferior function alone. So, by having relationships with people whose lead function is the other's inferior function, the individual stands to increase their health, balance, and ability to deal with people unlike themselves. This doesn't need to be understood at the moment, but everyone does have all 8 functions. This means that there are types that are opposites in several ways, such as the INTP and the ENTJ. The 8 functions of the INTP in order are introverted thinking, extroverted intuition, introverted sensation, extroverted feeling, extroverted thinking, introverted intuition, extroverted sensation, and introverted feeling. The 8 functions of the ENTJ are in order: extroverted thinking, introverted intuition, extroverted sensation, introverted feeling, introverted thinking, extroverted intuition, introverted sensation, and extroverted feeling. This pairing literally lines up on no function, yet can often work well together due to their similarities in intent. Communication usually relies on the maturity of both types, but a focus on abstract and logical subjects can create a wonderful conversation between the two. What can be considered true opposites would be the INTP and the ISFP. The functions of the ISFP are, in order, introverted feeling, extroverted sensation, introverted intuition, extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, introverted sensation, extroverted intuition, and introverted thinking. These types have almost nothing in common, and so it is less often that you can perceive relationships easily forming between INTPs and ISFPs than you can perceive between ENTJs and INTPs. This is because although the INTP and the ENTJ do not have a common language, they have common motivations. They both want to build in abstract and reasonable ways. The ISFP has nothing in common with the INTP, even though they are the ISFP is the inverse of the ENTJ. This is because the focus on the function in the ISFP is on a concrete and personal emotionalism. The ENTJ can benefit heavily from this perspective because it is a piece of themselves that they often neglect, but the INTP cannot relate. Not only do they often completely tune out from sensation, often forgetting to shower or clean their room, but they also have a very indirect relationship with their own sense of feeling. They're not the type to care about their own emotions, not because they neglect them, but because their personal feelings aren't what interests them. ENTJs, on the other hand, do tend to neglect their emotions, which do end up being important to them. There's another theory that would place the INTJ as the true opposite for the INTP, as their function stacks are completely mismatched, meaning that while the INTP has a rational primary function, the INFJ has an irrational primary function. However, theorizing can be endless. No matter how you cut up the functions and understand them, the point is that what are perceived as opposites are much more similar than they are thought to be. There is a little difference between the ways ESFJ and INTP think, difference in emphasis. This is why one must consider the functions instead of the titles of the archetypes. By organizing the archetypes in accordance with the middle two variables, you misunderstand the truth behind the way that the functions are organized. Don't worry about the shadow functions for now, as they are different subject. But now it is understood that if you take the XSTX types, then you will have two pairs of two types with the same functions, but that those two sets will have opposite functions from one another. Thus, categorization will not be incredibly useful in understanding or predicting behavior. Those types will most likely get along with each other, but they will most likely not act like one another. So, organize the types by function. For example, ISFJs, ESFJs, ENFJs, and INFJs all have extroverted feeling as their primary or auxiliary function. This means that all of these types are socially drawn, relying on input from the world around them, while also not being entirely authentic. All of these types are prone to go along with the feelings around them, such as partying, enjoying a certain author or artist, or remembering something fondly if others do, even if their personal experience with it was negative. This grouping also reveals that all of them have introverted thinking as either a tertiary or an inferior function. Due to this, you can tell that all of them have a desire for independence and their own interpretation of the world around them, but that they prefer to hide such thoughts underneath an agreeable exterior. Knowing this will help you prepare to interact with these sorts of people, as often people are tricked by extroverted feeling. They see the displays of warmth that every type with it exudes as an authentic embrace of the people around them, thus including the person who is interacting with them. Often, The types with extroverted feelings are judged as shallower than they really are, because it's so easy to get along with them. If you understand that, then you can work past the pleasantries and try to engage with the thoughts that they honestly have. This comes off as respectful to the extroverted feeling dominance, because most people treat them like wallpaper. They're easy to get along with and agreeable, so people tend to talk over them. By using their willingness to talk to others about what they're interested in, you communicate that you are interested in them as an individual, not an experience. ESFJs, ISFJs, ENFJs, and INFJs will all appreciate this deeply. They tire of being considered good listeners with nothing to say. Categories like this also benefit from making Venn diagrams instead of binaries. The INFJs and the ENFJs are part of the group that uses extroverted feeling, but both are also part of the group that uses introvert intuition as either their primary or secondary function. This puts them in the same grouping as INTJs and ENTJs, instead of being perceived by others as similar type. All of these types can rely on their inner need for silence and reflection. They are prone to go through experiences that can be compared to being spoken through by a spiritual power. The INTJs and the ENTJs will express this differently than the INFJs and the ENFJs, but all four of them rely heavily on a personal sense of vision. By grouping the INFJs and the ENFJs, a lot can be seen about their character, due to them belonging to the types who rely on extroverted feeling. Both types are prone to expressing themselves in accordance with the environment around them. They are slow to create disharmony, although they often have criticism, regardless of whether they voice it or not, different than the other pair that they share extroverted feelings with. INFJs and ENFJs use introverted intuition to fill in the gaps of extroverted feeling. It is through their reliance on introverted intuition that they are able to seek out aesthetics from their criticisms and create a worldview. The ENFJs will rely more on the atmosphere of the environment that they are in, playing into creating it and maintaining the moods that are already present, hopefully allowing ideas to flourish in the process. The INFJs will rely more on that inner vision and try to find the proper people to share that vision with so that they can come into fruition. By analyzing the different groups that archetypes fit into, you can get a much better overview of them instead of making simplistic categories. Just as the individuals are fluid with the types are fluid with themselves. None of this should be insisted upon, only observed. The final thing to mention about the archetypes is that there are different expressions of those archetypes. This means that an ESTJ may fully be an ESTJ, but with a stronger relationship to introverted sensation than they have to extroverted thinking. Although it may seem like this makes the ESTJ an ISTJ, it does not, because they can still fit within the archetype while being developed differently. The biggest difference in the ESTJ with an underdeveloped introverted sensation and an ISTJ would be the different function pairings they rely on. All functions with the same directions are complementary. For example, introverted feeling pairs well with both introverted sensation and introverted intuition. In healthy individuals, this creates a harmony that promotes strength as the functions learn to accommodate the various weaknesses of each other. When the individual isn't so lucky, then the situation is different. Instead of being complementary functions, the matching functions end up creating a loop. With the ESTJ, their complementary functions would be extroverted thinking and extroverted intuition. If they balanced their life and matured healthily, this would provide a powerhouse of information for the ESTJ. They're constantly able to sort information while also being able to take in new material to sift through regularly. Their ability to amalgamate and pursue content is unmatched when they're on top of their game. However, it is important that they have a balance with their other functions. namely introverted sensation and introverted feeling. If they don't develop these functions, then the loop between extroverted thinking and extroverted intuition will command all of these resources and attention of the ESTJ, leaving them constantly working with no room to address their own lives. The story of the ISTJ is much different. Their complementary functions are introverted sensation and introverted feeling. When they're not at their best, they are the true preservers of society and family, capable of remembering legends and myths long since forgotten by others. These are the people who make sure that art collections are preserved through economic hardship. Without maturity, there is no grace to this, though, and they end up spoiling away, locked in their sentimentality. Their loop leaves them unwilling to engage with the world and to infatuate with their memories. So an ESTJ with either an overdeveloped or a dominant introverted sensation would look similar to the ESTJ. They may need more time to recover than most other ESTJs, and they may have a deeper sense of history, but their issues remain the same. If they don't take care of themselves, they find themselves extending into overactivity, taking on way more than they can handle. That's one of the sure ways to tell if they are an ESTJ with a strong introverted sensing, or if they are an ISTJ. If they're prone to the problems associated with extroverted thinking, extroverted intuition loop, such as hyperactivity and scattered projects while completely forgetting themselves, then they're likely an ESTJ. If they're prone to the problems associated with the introverted sensing, introverted feeling loop, such as withdrawing themselves for extended periods to rot within nostalgia and neglecting their responsibilities, then they're likely an ISTJ. If they resemble the ESTJ and they still rely on introverted sensing, either as much or more as extroverted thinking, then they can be referred to as ESTJ-SI. These types are rare, so they will not be discussed deeply in this book, but they are a reality and an interesting one. They are highlighted to bring out that the structure of the archetype is accommodating, and that each is more complicated than a single profile on them. Keep in mind that if someone resembles an archetype except for a few habits, then there's a chance that they rely on their auxiliary function more than others within the same archetype. It's also of note that some individuals have some powerful function pairings that it's difficult to read which one is their dominant. Using the ESTJ, it's hard to analyze them when they're unhealthy and bursting with energy, as they can dip into their extroverted thinking, extroverted intuition pair so heavily that they can be read as ENFPs. So instead, try to focus on which complementary functional pair individuals use, because if you could sense both extroverted thinking and introverted sensing within the primary habits of the ESTJ, you would know that they'd be either an ISTJ or an ESTJ. Even if you couldn't tell if their primary function was extroverted thinking or extroverted intuition, usually it's easy to tell that they use introverted sensing more than introverted feeling. While the tertiary function can be overdeveloped in relation to the auxiliary function, it's very rare for the inferior function to be developed more than the auxiliary. Once you knew that they were using introverted sensing as their introverted function, you'd know they'd have extroverted thinking as their primary function. This is because if the auxiliary function is an introverted perceiving function, then the primary function needs to be an extroverted judging function and vice versa. You only need to understand what pair of functions a person uses primarily to understand their type essentially. The difference between an ISTJ and an ESTJ is only in order of function. Once you know that they're XSTJ, you know the language that you can expect to use to communicate with them.